Hello, everyone. My name is Dave. I'm with the Digital Asia Hub, and just want to confirm that the sound is okay. I'm getting a comment on Zoom that sound's not coming through.
Yeah, all good.
Okay, great. So hi, everyone. My name is Dave. I'm with the Digital Asia Hub, and I'm really happy to join this session to chair. I just want to take this note to thank Xiang and the ADM+S for putting together this wonderful program. I wish I could have joined in person, but I've been sneaking my way on Zoom yesterday and today as well to listen into the discussions. And I think we'll move straight into the session. I'm sure you had a wonderful keynote early in the morning, looking at art and having a nice jam session with Malvika. So I think in this session, we're going to move into a little bit more into history and the not as much creative part of ADM+S, which is bureaucracies and administrations. So I think with that, I'll move into the first speaker, and who is Adam Knight, who I believe is in person, is already standing by the podium. And as is ADM+S custom, I will let Adam share a few lines to introduce himself and then jump straight into his talk. So over to you, Adam.
Thanks, Dave. So I'm Adam. I'm a PhD student at Leiden University. If you really want to know more about me, you can look in the program. And I'll get right to it. So I'm in the final stages of, oh, sorry, that's the wrong presentation. It's a good start. Warwick, do you want to swap?
Look, we could. I'll have a go at mathematics.
So I'm in the final stages of writing up the dreaded dissertation on governance, ideology, and technology in China, focus on social credit, like so many other people here at the conference. But today I actually want to take the opportunity to talk about something completely different, something incredibly tangential, and to, in many ways, get back to the academic basics, to put it very frankly, to talk about something that's just kind of cool, kind of interesting, some classified CIA documents that I stumbled across in some early media reporting from the 1950s that you may or may not find interesting, but I certainly had a lot of fun procrastinating with. And what I want to do is explore kind of why we're here at this conference. What are some of the origins of automated decision-making in the early Mao era? We've got some slides. There we go. We full screen that maybe? Is that going to be possible? No worries if not. Anyway, 1950s. It's not a period that's typically synonymous with data-driven governance, of course. Yet despite the kind of anti-rational, anti-scientific tyranny that the later Maoist period has become pretty synonymous with, the first half of the 1950s really started to establish quite an important legacy for what was to come and many of the topics that we're talking about today. Now, the decade began with what Arnab Ghosh has called a kind of crisis in counting, right? You know, effective policymaking, as we all know, kind of typical James Scott, requires reliable data on the size of internal features of a population. But after kind of years of war and relative kind of destruction, so first anti-Japanese and then civil, the party, as it came to power, knew effectively nothing about the population it had inherited, and leaving it kind of unable to enact some of its most ambitious commitments to socialist re-engineering. Now, they weren't left with absolutely nothing. There was a bit of infrastructure left over from the Republican period. And what we saw in the 50s was some important progress being made in the establishment of modern Chinese statistical information gathering systems. And many of the PRC's early flagship policies, so land reform, collectivization, etc., required an accurate picture of society. So what we started to see was some early statistical exercises. There was a pretty no-frills basic census carried out in 1953. Tom Mulaney has done a really great study on the ethnic classification project in 1954. He's also got a book coming out very soon on the origins of the first Chinese computer in 1953 and 4. Gordon Barrett has shown that even in the kind of darkest depths of the Cultural Revolution and the late 50s, China was participating in transnational scientific exchange. But today, what I want to focus on is kind of one example of some of this early interface with scientific and statistical rationales, and that is the rise of operational research and early automated decision-making and the application of technology and governance through the setup of the 1956 Institute of Automation and the Institute of Computing Technology. And my hope is to kind of show that far from a scientific wasteland that the 1950s and the 1960s is often characterized as, what we actually saw at this time was some very important early developments in data-driven administration in China that laid some important groundwork, both institutional and popular, for what was to come. So what is operational research and what is its relevance in the Chinese context? So operational research or operations research, OR, is the application of scientific methods to the management and administration of organized military, governmental, commercial, and industrial processes. It's an attempt to provide those who manage organized systems with an objective and quantitative basis for any decision that they're making. Decisions that are normally carried out by teams of scientists and engineers, and it draws on a wide variety of different academic disciplines. Crucially, it is concerned with systems in which human behavior plays an important role and must be factored in and modeled. Its modern study originates in World War II Britain, as scientific teams attempted to teach military leaders on how to use new technologies, specifically radar technologies, to locate enemy aircraft. And at first they kind of analyzed just physical equipment and communication networks, but later realized that actually a very important factor when it comes to tracking, enemy aircraft was the behavior of operating personnel and relevant executives, and that these factors also had to be baked into the various calculations that you were making. Now, by the end of the war, it was being applied in all three branches of the British military. It also spread to Australia, Canada, France, and most consequentially, for future developments, of course, the United States. And there it began to evolve in sync with broader interests in the application of scientific method in decision-making, management, and policy. Now, operational research is very closely related to systems engineering more widely, specifically the field of cybernetics. Cybernetics, of course, being a kind of precursor to early artificial intelligence, cognitive science, advanced computing, concerned with feedback processes in ecological and biological environments predominantly, as well as how these could be used to better understand and manage complex social and technological systems. Now, the history of cybernetics in China is a kind of interesting roller coaster, taking their lead from the Soviet Union, who initially dismissed cybernetics as a bourgeois Western pseudoscience, along with a whole bunch of other scientific fields, including genetics. China had no official interest in the topic in the very earliest years of the PRC. But as we started to see de-Stalinization happening, there came a re-examination of the subject in the USSR and some very fascinating developments in that national context. And what we start to see in the early 50s are a bunch of study group visits from China over to Russia to observe, among other things, computer research techniques in industry and agriculture. And those teams started to bring back equipment and, most importantly, kind of ideological principles of how this could be applied in the Chinese context. In 1956, with the 12-year scientific plan, as well as a kind of year-end list of priority research categories, new electronic and automated techniques was listed as the second most important thing for Chinese scientists and policymakers to be working on, second only to nuclear research. And this shift coincided with the return of Chinese leading aerospace engineer Qian Xuesun, who I assume we're going to hear a lot more about with Gianluigi's presentation a little bit later, so I won't talk too much about him now. He had moved to the US in 1935 to study at MIT and returned to China some 20 years later under a cloud of Red Scare paranoia. Instead, what I want to do today is focus a little bit on the lesser known, lesser told story of Hua Luogong and his role in introducing operational research, cybernetics, automated decision-making to China. Now, Hua was a child prodigy, to say the least. He was born in 1910, showed great mathematical promise, really received no kind of formal education at all. He went to 6 years of primary school, 3 years of secondary education, and that was it. Never went to university or anything, but he did show phenomenal talent in analytical number theory, the theory of complex functions, algebra, etc. And in what was probably quite a bold move in 1930, he sent a letter in to the popular magazine Cursor, basically showing that, you know, there's this paper that you published and there was a mistake in it. He was correct. And this got picked up by a professor at Tsinghua University who invited him to join the faculty first as a librarian, but within 3 years, he'd been promoted several times to the rank of lecturer. In 1935, Chen Xuesun returns, as I mentioned before. He went out to MIT, so he left Tsinghua, went over to MIT, and right at that time, MIT professor and founder of the field of cybernetics, Norbert Wiener, arrived at Tsinghua. It's a kind of often overlooked period of Norbert Wiener's kind of general academic time. And Hua attended many of Wiener's lectures, and we know that the two spoke on several occasions. Indeed, Hua left a very deep impression because when Wiener then moved to Cambridge in Britain in 1936, he managed to persuade Cambridge University to extend an invite to Hua to come over, again, despite no formal academic training, to come and study in the UK, where he stayed for a couple of years before returning to China during the anti-Japanese war. Now, when he was back in China in the kind of post-PRC founding period, he became director of the new Mathematics Institute at CAS, the Chinese Academy of Sciences, and was also a member of the standing committee of the MPC. During this time, he pursued a strategy for Chinese mathematics where most resources were going into fields such as differential equations, statistics, these things that had been kind of seriously neglected before 1949. But were going to be most relevant for the buildup of industry in the planned economy. Hua himself was very active in the establishment of computational mathematics in China. He built algorithms for numerical solutions of analytically intractable problems, and he was kind of fundamental to the first attempts to build a native domestic Chinese computer in 1952 and 1953. Most importantly, however, he was at the heart of the kind of popularization of science and mathematics in China, writing a lot of newspaper articles, delivering a lot of lectures. He really kind of seemed to embody this belief that in serving the people, and that the goal should be to expand academic mathematics and raise its overall technical level, establishing a whole bunch of schools and programs as a result. Now, in 1956, Hua was appointed the head of China's new Institute of Computing Technology, which was the same year that the Institute of Automation, headed up by Qian Weicheng, who we see here, was also set up. And his clout over the Mathematical Institute, however, started to become pretty undermined in the anti-rightist movement on account of a few documents that he wrote during the 100 Flowers campaign. But as we see the Great Leap Forward start to unfurl in 1958 through 1960, traditional academic mathematics started to be condemned for hindering this idea of linking theory and practice, a key kind of demand, obviously, on science in the Maoist period. Hua was criticized as being primarily responsible, especially for his teaching of advanced fundamental mathematics. But one thing I think we should really understand about Hua was that he was not only a kind of brilliant mind, but a brilliant opportunist in the most positive sense of the word. Someone who kind of understood the need for graft, the need to pivot, the need to kind of switch up what he was doing. Now, the Great Leap Forward, for all of its statistical abuses and anti-scientific rationales, was a time, however, of great technological innovation in a lot of ways, obviously coming from quite a low base. Its programs drew on many, many different scientific theories, many of them flawed, of course, to achieve status goals of agronomic progress and optimization. And of course, computational automation would play its role. Here we see a list of just some of the intended applications for computer automation in 1958. So programs of agricultural reforms, artificial weather modification, algae farming as a solution to healthier diets, the introduction of biomass and solar energy. And it was in this same year, in 1958, that Hua founded the Laboratory of Operational Research at the Mathematical Institute at CAS. And at this time, he starts to pivot away from theoretical maths towards applied maths and the use of linear programming, in particular to help industrial development. And what we start to see is the popularization of this through the operational research campaign of 1958 to 60, or Yunzhouxue, Yundong. So the operational research movement saw kind of esoteric concepts such as linear programming, which is a method for achieving kind of best possible outcomes in mathematical models, as well as dynamic programming, game theory, queuing theory, carried out by mathematics students and teachers to ordinary Chinese workers and peasants in an attempt to raise production rates. It began rather hesitantly in Shandong province in the autumn of 58, wasn't particularly well received by local officials, and not a huge amount was achieved in the kind of earliest months and years until the provincial party committee issued directives to kind of mobilize the campaign further. Eventually, it saw about 3,000 teachers, students and scientists from 30 different institutions, as well as over 100,000 middle school students and teachers begin the study and the propagation and the application of operational research at scale. Starts to gain momentum in 59 and 60, with researchers making their way down to rural areas, according to local newspaper reporting, with examples such as in Heze in Shandong province, 300 researchers spending 20 days living and working with transport workers, following trucks around, making observations, pulling hand carts, applying linear programming to transportation problems, apparently, according to newspaper reporting, saving Jining Transportation Authority 2 million renminbi at the time. Now, all types of different problems were being solved by linear programming at this time. And I'm just going to skip ahead in a little interest of time. And these successes start to attract some national attention. So in 1960, Hua publishes a 5-part serial essay in the People's Daily on the use of mathematics. Mao himself is photographed with a book called Commune Mathematics, produced by the staff of Tufo Normal University in Shandong. And this example from Shandong province starts to be used as a model, right, in a kind of typical kind of Chinese governance principle to be applied elsewhere. And we see this operational research conference in 1960, attended by 370 researchers, being used as an example to kind of push out programs across the country. And again, we start to see, list a few of them here, some of the other applications of operational research in Wuhan University, in Hefei University, in Hebei University, and kind of big character posters, blackboard bulletins, radio broadcasts, pictorials, all kind of promoting this idea of linear programming. And Hua was kind of instrumental himself in, of course, pushing all of this out. He sets up this so-called Hualuogong team, Xiaofengdui, who over the next kind of 10 years visit 20 different provinces, delivering open air study sessions in factories and workshops. It's a team of final year students who, in order to graduate, had to go and, instead of writing a thesis, had to go out and deliver these lectures in kind of open air study sessions. And we see just a few photographs of those here. The largest and most critical of these projects were often located kind of quite far from Beijing in the hinterland, the kind of third line. I think probably the biggest, most impressive one was a team sent out to help with the construction of a new railway network from Chengdu to Kunming. So over 1,100 kilometers, 400 tunnels, 600 bridges, kind of huge logistical and operational undertaking. And the team kind of went down. They had 40 researchers who went down, and based on kind of linear programming methods, were able to reduce construction times and personnel needs to the point where, by organizing against, into new divisions and regiments and battalions and finding new ways of networking those construction principles, they were able to free up a whole bunch of labor to then go and work on other projects. And this battle group started to fall apart at the beginning of the Cultural Revolution, as they were kind of recalled back to their places of origin. But 6 members did stay on in Yunnan during the Cultural Revolution, even during its kind of most problematic years, though eventually, when armed conflict started to arise in Sichuan province, they did have to return. Now, for all of his work, Hua and his team received a huge amount of praise, letter of commendation from Mao personally. This is something that granted him safe passage during the Cultural Revolution. And indeed, he survived the Cultural Revolution relatively unscathed, protected by Zhou Enlai and many of the other senior military leaders whose children were actually part of his research teams. The Gang of Four deeply resented, however, Hua's fame, his authority, his respect, and eventually branded him an idealist and being unscientific. Jiang Qing even demanded the removal of Hua from the NPC and the dispersal of his team, though he did actually have a heart attack in 1975, so that would put an end to some of that political infighting. The OR campaign, and specifically Hua's work, however, and that of his entourage, is more than just an interesting snapshot in time. Left an important legacy, I think, for the profile of scientific and technical expertise in the post-Cultural Revolution era, particularly with the rise of the new technological revolution that would start to dominate discourse in, after 1978. And in my mind, there are kind of two key contributions that we see carrying forward from this time. The first was that Hua's team was a very important cultivation, a safe space for talent, if you like, in a time of very limited opportunities. So this small team was a way out of mediocrity or persecution into meaningful work that was kind of being praised by party cadres and ordinary workers alike. And what we see, and no time to talk about it today, is that members of Hua's original small team would go on in the post-Cultural Revolution period to hold some very, very important positions right across China's scientific policymaking spectrum. Of course, the other side of it is the kind of popularization aspect. The popularization of science that we see post-1978 was, of course, again, all part of, the groundwork had been laid by Hua during this time. Hua himself would be fully rehabilitated after the National Science Conference. We see here this kind of monumental painting that was painted for the 40th anniversary. We see Hua on the left-hand side here, just two people away from Deng Xiaoping, next to his protege Chen Jingwen as well. So just to very quickly wrap up, what does all of this mean for how we think about automated decision making? I think clearly this is all somewhat crude, the applications, right, in comparison to applications that we see today. But clearly the history of computational methods in automated decision-making in China is much deeper than the current examples that we see today. Its evolution has been subject to influence from a very wide range of different actors, only a handful of which I've touched on today: red and expert, civilian and military, foreign and domestic. Each of these have left a kind of indelible mark on the development of ADM in China. It's also something that is clearly deeply ideological and political. I think we're going to hear a bit more about that from Warwick. The debates are largely framed by tensions between ideology and scientific expertise throughout the 20th century. And again, this is something we've seen a return to, obviously, in the last few years, the kind of use of technology and the promotion of a particular ideological goal. Of course, it was also an example of China as part of a global discourse on technology as well, not only an observer, but actually an active participant, selectively borrowing global discourse and applying that to very local practicalities. And while distinct periods do emerge, there are strong continuities between them as well, with legacies that are very far-reaching beyond the dividing lines of 1949, 1978, 2012, et cetera, et cetera. So I've almost certainly gone over my time, so thank you, Dave, for not interrupting me. But thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to any questions you might have.
Thank you, Adam.
Yeah, sorry, I went very over time there.
That was I think in all the discussion around machine learning systems, it's always nice to remember the humans behind the systems. So that was a really nice profile into Hua Luoguang. Yes, in the interest of time, I'm going to go straight to Xiang for her presentation.
Yes, thank you very much, Dave. And I really enjoyed Adam's presentation. And good morning, everyone. I'm Xiang from Zhejiang University. I'm from the Department of Government. And thank you very much for organizing such a wonderful conference on ADM and Chinese societies. It is a pity that I cannot join the discussion on site, but I hope that we will be able to meet in the near future. And you are most welcome to Hangzhou and to Zhejiang University. So now I will share my PPT. Okay. Can you see the PowerPoints right now?
Yes.
Okay, great. let me just get back to the first page. Yes. So I think that Adam's presentation really shows us the role of science in China's governance model. And what I'm going to present is a manuscript I co-authored with Jessica Tees from the Middlebury College. It is also our book project, China's New Governance Model. And in this study, we attempt to examine how digital technologies, and also we mentioned a little bit about the role of the data scientists and other technocrats, how do they contribute to the evolution of current China state institution. As we are still in the middle of working on our project, I'm looking forward to your comments and suggestions. So, okay. So digitalization has been one of the most prominent aspects of the Chinese society since the 80th Party Congress. For one thing, we noted that China now has more than 1 billion internet users, which is more than the combination of the digital population from India and the United States combined in 2022. And for another, in recent years, the government also quickly incorporated cutting-edge digital technologies to promote efficient public administration, quality public service, and agile urban governance in recent years, as we learned a lot yesterday. As the State Council urges the local governments to build a digital government, we also find in a survey conducted in 2021 from Zhejiang province that more than 98% of the respondents, the government officials, reported that they have installed digital government applications to their mobile phones, and over 70% reported that they use the internet every day to get their job done. So the digitalization of China's administrative branch demonstrates that the Chinese government's efforts of constructing what we call a dataist state. So dataism is a philosophy of governance. It declares that a society consists of data flows, and the state's responsibility is to collect and process that data, because they believe that by using these data, we will be able to deal with those very complicated, like modern governance problems. And the Chinese government also acknowledges the value of the data. In 2015, China's State Council issued an action called the Action to Promote Big Data Development. It states explicitly that the big data reveals the correlation that the traditional technologies cannot detect. So government's data sharing, open data, convergence with societal data as well, will be able to increase government's ability to analyze data and provide new tools to deal with the complicated societal social problems effectively. So generally speaking, for the Chinese government, there are 3 steps involved in creating a data state. First is to have massive data collection. And the second is data sharing or aggregation across borders. And the third is to adopt big data analysis tools with algorithms, so we will be able to process a huge amount of data. However, while the students of China studies have noted that the Chinese government have invested in digitalizing the physical space by installing massive surveillance cameras, sensors, and IoTs, there are also obstacles to constructing a digital government in China. First and foremost, China's extensive acquisition of data on citizens' behavior, socioeconomic activities, and the use of nature and public spaces has raised significant concerns about the surveillance state. And these concerns are not only coming from outside of the government, but also come from within the government. And secondly, probably most importantly, the mass installment of surveillance facilities does not guarantee good governance or big brother, because the state agencies, they might be motivated to collect data, but they are usually unwilling to share these data with their colleagues because there's risks. And if their colleagues misuse these data, they are also under the risk that they will be accused by the citizens or even cause like lawsuits. So this kind of problems regarding data sharing across borders is especially true in China, because we having this fragmented governance model since the reform era. So thus, we must keep in mind that the features of a dataist state in China is not only shaped by the digital technology specifications, but it is also influenced by the strategic moves of the state actors. So this is what we want to do in this research. We want to present how the China's up-level government strategically adopt digital technology and promote organizational transformation. To achieve this goal, we conducted in-depth fieldwork since 2017 in Zhejiang province. So why Zhejiang? We chose Zhejiang because Zhejiang is one of the most decentralized provinces in mainland China since 1978. And it is also a pioneer in digital transformation, as here Hangzhou is the hometown to China's giant digital technological company, Alibaba. And even though Zhejiang cannot represent the general picture in China, we believe that Zhejiang is a mature case for examining the evolution of state institutions during the digital era. And while we are doing our research, we used participatory observations, focus group meetings, individual interviews, and surveys with subnational officials during the past 5 years. I also participated in drafting several local government documents regarding digital government. So all these opportunities gives us an insider's perspective to understand how the Zhejiang provincial government and its local governments and the bureaus responded to the digital era and strategically utilizing the digital technology for public service and for reconstructing the government organization. I would certainly love to share the details of this fieldwork notes with you, but I'm afraid Dave will have to stop me because it will take too long. So here are just a few key points we learned from the empirical work. First, we noticed that high-level governments have attempted to adopt digital technologies for their new vision of what we call the holistic governance since 2013. Here we would love to introduce one concept is the enacted technology. Enacted technology shows that it highlights that the technology alone does not determine the outcome of governance, but it highlights its importance to look at the intention of the actors and to examine how they adopt and implement information technology in pursuing certain interests and goals within the specific context of public organizations. This is especially true in China because back in the 1990s, China also had one e-government project called the Golden Projects. But by that time, China's e-government projects were embedded in its highly fragmented governance model. It also created many interlaced information systems and led to a problem today the government officials describe as the information isolation within the administrative system. However, after the 80s Party Congress, the central government highlight the top-level design. So the intention of adopting technology evolves quickly from the 1990s to the 2000s. Now it aims to develop a holistic governance model as response to the crisis in local governance and a growing tendency of localism. And the text analysis we learned from the party documents also confirms this intention of the central authority. It shows that in recent years, the term related with two key elements of holistic governance. Here is centralized decision-making and strict policy implementation. As the terms related to these two terms has increased significantly over the years. It is worth noting that the trend began slightly earlier than 2013, but the word's frequency increased more quickly after the 80s Party Congress. So, of course, the central government's intention does not promise digital transformation. It is what they wanted to do, but will they be able to deal with the problems such as data aggregation inside a fragmented administrative system? During our fieldwork, we also noted that high-level government officials often complained about the unshareable data from the isolated information system developed by the actors from various agencies across the regions and at different government levels. These actors, I mean the local agencies and the bureaucrats, they are not motivated to give up their monopoly power over the data. So that means they're not willing to share their data even with their colleagues from another department, not to mention from another level or from another region. So in other words, the massive data aggregation, even within a unitary state, would encounter potential resistance from both within and outside the bureaucracy. It will take time and requires appropriate marginal returns to generate public and bureaucratic support for constructing a data estate. So how does the Chinese government deal with this problem? Based on our fieldwork, we realized that the Chinese government has generally taken 3 steps in order to move from a more fragmented model to a more holistic form of digital government with automated decision-making. So here are the 3 steps, from Internet plus government service back in the 2016, later to a platform government initiated somewhere around 2018, and now smart governance. Since then, a few local governments initiated smart governance much earlier, but nationally it's in just in the recent 2 or 3 years. And external observers most noticed the changes forms of government service, that's the frontline part. However, our interview with those officials from within the state suggest that the upgrades of the frontline public service often reflect new forms of adopted digital technology and the evolving organizational structure. So at the very first beginning, the high-level government officials, when they realize that they are encountering a very fragmented governance model, they're not trying to centralize the system at once. What they did is to continue adopting a decentralized model. What they wanted to do is only convince the local officials to connect their fragmented information system together, so they will be able to provide holistic service to the citizens. So to achieve this goal, it only requires the local governments to share their documents among public agencies. And by doing so, it is already enough to enable what we call on-request one-stop service, 最多跑一次, and reduce citizens' administrative burden in getting access to government service. So you don't have to transform the fragmented governance model to achieve on-request one-stop service. What you have to do is to connect these information systems together. However, the provincial government soon noted that the differentiated rules adopted by the local governments during the reform era as they developed those decentralized information systems has made it very hard for the citizens and entrepreneurs to complete what we call the cross-regional matters, because the citizens now have to mobile from one county to another and even across provinces. As Zhejiang's urbanization rate reaches 72 in 2020, this kind of cross-regional matters became quite severe and common among citizens and entrepreneurs. So the provincial government is now determined to deal with this kind of issues. So the provincial bureaus, after they convince the local government, what they have to do is to connect the information systems. They soon change their intention and convince the local government that they must develop centralized and provincially unified information systems. So in this way, the citizens and the entrepreneurs will be able to get smooth services from the government. It is a very legitimate course. So the local government, because during the first phase, the high-level government already understands the design of the local systems, and it reduces the obstacles for the provincial bureaus to step in. So since then, the centralized information system not only enables the provincial government to build what we call a digital iron cage imposed on its local agencies, because all the standards and the procedures has been regulated now by the provincial government. But it also allows the up-level government to have access to nearly all governmental data, no matter where they are, even at the most remote area of Zhejiang province. And these data can be used for digital supervision, and it has been used for that purpose. However, the provincial bureaus are more enthusiastic about exploring the more intelligent and smart way of utilizing the cutting-edge technologies, including big data and algorithms. So during the past few years, we realized that this Zhejiang provincial government states an ambitious new digital transformation goal. They stated that they wanted to promote the more scientific and a precise governance model in Zhejiang province. In practice, the up-level government have adopted automated service delivery to ensure full policy implementation, and they also developed city brains and commanding centers to centralize the decision-making authority for enacting smart governance. So to summarize, the high-level government utilized the advantage of digital technology in providing accessible, convenient, and agile service to citizens with a far lower administrative burden. And as these upgraded digital services are often linked with organizational transformation from within the state, from inside the state, the high-level government also successfully leveraged the public support to counteract the reluctance or even resistance from the discontent of local bureaucrats. As a consequence, the high-level government now gradually developed centralized and unified information systems to replace the fragmented local ones and constructed data centers to collect massive amount of data from multi-sources. And as data is aggregated to those at the up level, decision-making authorities also flow quickly to the center of the administrative system. And in the meantime, the centralized information system connected surveillance cameras, automated service deliveries, methods, and big data analysis all served the central government to impose what we call a strict digital iron cage from the top down. So while centralized decision-making authority and the effective policy implementation, digital technology have become a fine tool for constructing a holistic governance model, because the central government proposed as early as in 2013, and they also strategically leverage the popular support to contain the bureaucratic resistance. This trend of centralization and bureaucratization is also confirmed by our 2021 official survey in Zhejiang province. In our survey, 2/3 of the local officials agrees that digitalization strengthens the high-level government's authority, and the street-level bureaucrats are more likely to sense a loss of autonomy due to digitalization. So it indicates that there is a bureaucratic alienation which is caused by the digital cage of reasons with minimum discretional power inside the bureaucratic system now. So, and finally, these improved findings also points to the conclusion that a digital administrative state is rising in China at this moment. The administrative state is a term that was conceptualized by Edward Wardle in the 1950s to depict the statecraft of the United States since the progressive era. An administrative state worships science and perceives facts, measurements, and research as the core of scientific management. Today, Chinese officials are also convinced by technocrats, data scientists, and private contractors in the big data business that the government will be able to utilize big data, the oil of the digital era, to achieve good governance. And from Adam's presentation, we learned that this is also a tradition, can be traced back to the early days of People's Republic of China. And this vision gives the Chinese government officials the confidence that they will be able to develop commanding centers or brains to facilitate scientific decision and insist strict control of their subordinates, because this would be an effective way to achieve good governance. And in addition, a full picture of the administrative state will require us to zoom out and examine the governance structure of the state institution as a whole. An administrative state suggests that the state's preference for finding answers to governance problems from the executive branch, as we see from the what we call these days data-empowered government, 数字赋能政府. It is guided by the professionals deploying advanced science findings, indicating that the administrative system is now outgrowing the legislative institution and the judiciary organs. In other words, the underlying role of science, or data science more specifically, could undermine the democratic institutions in China's new governance model. So this is our primary findings from our empirical work during the past few years in Zhejiang province. And I'm looking forward to your suggestions and comments. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Xiang. That was really informative, and I think we'll definitely get more into the decentralization versus centralization discussion also in tomorrow's session on Web3 and China. We don't have a lot of time, so I'm just going to go right to the next speaker, Warwick Powell, who I believe is in person in Melbourne.
Which one works? I'm not so good behind a lectern. I feel very constrained, and I'm a little bit more used to being freewheeling, I guess. My name's Warwick Powell. I wear two hats. And wearing two hats perhaps means I'm a jack of all trades. And sometimes it might mean that I fall through the cracks as well. My two hats are, in a very practical daily sense, I'm the founding chair of a blockchain software application research and design company, very much focused on designing distributed information systems and applying them in social and economic governance contexts, with particular emphasis on supply chain data integrity. And over the last 4 to 5 years, we've been implementing these design systems in cross-border trade and cross-border finance, particularly in relation to working with counterparties in China. My other hat is I'm an adjunct professor at Queensland University of Technology, and I was roped in a sense, back into the world of academia, partly because of the work I was doing in the commercial space to help design and lead a number of industry research collaboration initiatives under the umbrellas of a number of CRCs focused on distributed information systems. As a result of the work that we did, I began to ponder a number of seemingly paradoxical situations. And one of the big paradoxes to me was why it was that blockchains as a decentralized information system idea, emanating very much from the libertarian stripe, if you will, of Western political discourse, actually took root in China, and ultimately, come the late 2010s, was embedded in national strategic policy priorities and thinking. How is it that a very erstwhile centralized polity embraced this notionally libertarian distributed technology as part of its information architecture to drive informationalization and digitalization? Part of the answers lie, and I'll work through some slides in a tick, but part of the answers lie in the abilities to tackle the transaction cost problems that were touched on yesterday. And in some interesting ways, it also was part of a continual transition within a Marxist political economy frame that went from an emphasis on class struggle, if you will, relations of production, 生产关系, to an emphasis on the forces of production. And then ultimately, in the last 6 or 7 years, into a much more rarefied and in many ways more mechanical aspect of Marxist political economy, and one which in fact most people will have barely even got there. And that is the substance of volume 2 of Capital, which was, and I bet you no one's read volume 2 of Capital. We've got one person, which was about circulation. And when you think about the systems of the circulation of capital and the metamorphosis of capital, so I'll talk in Marxist political economy categories because this is in many ways the sort of driving intellectual architecture that underpins this adoption of distributed information systems. The grist that made it possible for capital to metamorphose from money capital to commodity capital through production to a new commodity and then back to money again, the speed at which that could happen was actually a function of information. Because the ability for money to flow in one direction was a function of the ability for credible information about things and processes to flow in the other direction. And I guess it's the idea of one hand moves the products, 一手交货, and the other hand moves the money, 一手交钱. And this idea of the circuit relationship between information about things and processes as the driver of the flow of information about value or money actually sat at the heart of the adoption of blockchain technologies. Yep. Now I'm going to jump to a couple of things very quickly, because what that has led me to think about really is what is the landscape that has emerged. And the landscape that seems to have emerged to me, And I'm very interested in the operational stuff, don't get me wrong, but at a higher level, it seems that we're seeing the emergence of a distinctly socialist governmentality around the idea of an ecology of data. So I'm going to touch on that very quickly. And this ecology of data is made possible by actually the emergence and advent of distributed ledger technologies. The second claim that I'm starting to make, and this is really just taking some ideas for a walk, is the idea that, in fact, Chinese digital statecraft is a kind of new ethics of democratic practice, contrary to almost all of the usual tropes around authoritarianism, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And for me, the authoritarian tropes don't really tell us very much. And in part, it's because it's a lazy description. You know, and it's the idea that, oh, we've given something a label and therefore we understand it. Whereas in fact, the practices of government are a hell of a lot more complicated than that. And as a result of that, there are some byproducts that have just sort of fallen off the back of the truck, if you will, unintended, but these are the things that I've started to think about. Obviously, it makes people outside of China reflect upon what democratic practice is. Secondly, it's the idea that, in fact, democratic practice as an ethics of democracy actually works through freedom anyway. So there's a kind of freedom that is fundamentally implicit in the way that information works through social bodies. Transparency is actually what makes this possible. And it's transparency that is the sine qua non of a public ecologies of data. If I get time later in discussions, I might touch on Byung-Chul Han's commentary around transparency and what that might mean in terms of the infocracy that is emerging and whether that, in a sense, takes away the politics of social life. Very quickly, I'm going to do two things, skip a whole bunch of slides. Conceptually, this idea of ecology of data really is like a supply chain of information systems. All right? So in a sense, for me, it's not an explicit way in which the field of visibility and the field of governance frames this necessarily, but it's actually the background, if you will, that makes a whole bunch of these discussions even intelligible today. And it goes to the idea that for information to be meaningful, we collect it, we produce it, we have ways in which we validate it. And validation is context contingent. What is valid in one context may not be meaningfully valid in another. We store data, we disseminate data, and we use data. And when I started thinking about the way the blockchains intersected into this space, the original frame was this dichotomy between centralized and decentralized, and it was a very bland way of thinking about it. And I think what's happening is that, in fact, people are having a more granular understanding of what decentralization, centralization might mean. So much so that I think it's probably more useful to think about this in terms of notions of polarity along different dimensions. And the three main dimensions is the technical dimension. How many machines are there doing things, right? The second one is what I call the authority dimension. How many agents are involved in making decisions about how these things should operate, the protocols? And the third dimension is geographic. How spread out are these machines? And these three things are not reducible to one another. And all these debates that we start to see happen now actually involve elements of discussions around polarity that cuts across each of these dimensions. And these vector points, if you will, is actually where debates and fights emerge about the contradictions that can sometimes exist between unipolar authority and multipolar geography, for example, and what are the implications of that. So that's just a way that I've been starting to think about the emergence of this terrain, if you will, this ecology that is actually the subject matter of governmental consideration. I'm going to skip all of this. and get to the fun stuff. I'm just going to end on two things. There's an emerging and very active Chinese literature on the role of blockchains in both contemporary governance, so the idea of zhili, and it revolves around three core ideas, which is the idea of co-production, gongjian, the idea of co-governance, gongzhi, and the idea of co-sharing, gongxiang. And those three elements actually feed nicely into those 6 dimensions of the ecology of data that I described. And blockchain technologies is being mobilized as a way of meeting the ambitions of the 3 gongs in practical application and environments. And it's also dovetailing into a very interesting discussion about party building, 党建 or gender. And the idea that distributed ledgers are now being mobilized as tools for credible party building, centralized party with distributed information tools. And the interesting thing is why? In the name of what? In the hopes of manifesting what? And my argument is that, in fact, it enables the creation of the bedrock that makes possible a democratic practice in a very particular sense. And it's actually a Durkheimian sense. So Durkheim, in Professional Ethics and Civic Morals, which very few people have read as well, because everyone looks at all of his other sociological stuff, talks a lot about what makes a polity democratic. And for him, what makes a polity democratic in large part is the extent to which there is effective dialogue and deliberation. It's actually not about all those other things that have now dominated the idea of, what counts as being democratic or otherwise. And the foundations for effective dialogue and deliberation is this idea that there is a common basis of truth. Not just information, and this is where I disagree with Han, but it's actually the ability to form some sense of a collective idea of what is an accepted truth. It doesn't have to be true in the grand epistemological sense, but it needs to be sufficiently valid in a practical sense. And distributed ledger technologies start to build the foundations for that. It enables us to have multiple nodes of information. It enables us to drive transparency, which tackles the problems that people have around capricious modifications of databases, corruption that arises as a result of that possibility, and those sorts of things. And so it is a form of common knowledge infrastructure. Now, I've seen a lot of this happen in the economic context in supply chains, because it means that instead of having to trust each other with information, we've actually got a common information base. These actually come out, these are my translations, but these are just some fantastic summary quotes about how blockchains are being articulated into this discussion around governance and party building. And it's all about the relationships between people, right? So we're starting to re-articulate information as a social practice, not just something that happens out there because we've got a machine that does it, but it's how social agents become part and parcel of information systems that makes each agent responsible in one way or another within that overall ecology. Now, there's credibility reasons for that, of course, because everyone's invested in a system in which they all contribute. Right? But there's actually an economics of governance as well. It's cheaper. When every phone that we all pay for ourselves is a collection device that we're responsible for, that we pay the power bills for, that we use to collect information and process information, all those sorts of things, then we've pushed out the costs to the edges of the system. And that starts to tackle some of the problems around the economy of digital governance. Push it out to the edges and get people to pay for it and willingly pay for it. Which means that we start to have a much lighter touch and a lower economic impact of this program of digitalisation. The last thing I'll mention, and then I'll draw a line here, is we're starting to also see the emergence of the idea of associations, not just in a formal organisational sense, which is the non-digital part. And we've seen over the last 5 years the blossoming of these blockchain industry collaborative research associations. But more fundamentally, distributed ledgers is causing operators within particular context, whether they're supply chains or whatever, to realise that they have a shared interest in a common information base and the integrity of that information base. And now they are using this technology to underpin the idea that, in fact, they are all members of an information association. And the political idea out of all of that, and this is where I'll probably leave my ramblings and, you know, taking these sets of ideas for a walk, is that, in fact, we're starting to see something that is quite non-Leninist, right? We're starting to see the mobilisation de facto of a bunch of political ideas that were more prominent in the late 1800s and early 1900s as democratic critiques of both Soviet centralism and parliamentary liberalism. And those threads of critique are found in the British associationalist traditions. And blockchains and distributed ledgers, oddly enough, even though they emerged out of a libertarian cesspit, pond, are now being mobilised in a way that delivers on a very different political ethos. And I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Warwick. That was a really nice transition from the history in 1950s, bringing it to the present day and blockchain. Looking at time, I think unfortunately we're already bleeding into the next session. So we won't have time for formal Q&A and discussion right now. But I think I encourage all of you who to use lunch and other breaks to sort of pose any of your questions that you have for the speakers. I'll use my liberty as the chair to just very quickly sort of draw a line, a thread between all the three talks. And I think it was great to start out with this question that Adam, this observation that Adam put down about the crisis in counting. And in a way that was true then, and in a way it's also true now, and this lack of data often drives so much of the systems and policies today, especially looking at the social credit system and this acknowledgement of the lack of financial data or lack of data in various government administrations, and that continues to drive so much of the policies today. And I think Xiang as well, that was really fascinating conclusion about how we moved maybe from more decentralized sort of governance to a more centralized governance, and data being a big part of that. And I think unpacking that and looking at how data can often maybe drive more decentralization, as maybe Warwick pointed out, but also maybe allows more centralization and more control from the center. And I think this idea of collective truth that Warwick just mentioned, I think that's really interesting to dive into. And I think relating back to maybe even Malvika's keynote in the start about this idea of what's reality and what's dreams, and can we even have an idea? Is there even a collective idea of truth? Is that even possible, or is truth inherently a very personal and individual thing? But with that, I will cede the sort of the flow, so to speak, back, and I want to thank all our speakers, Adam, Xiang, and Warwick, for those really interesting and provocative talks. And I'd love to hopefully get into more questions to the speakers, at least to Warwick and Adam during the breaks. So with that, thank you so much.